Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. So today I want to talk about the Joan Anderson Letter by Neal Cassady. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, the Joan Anderson Letter was a letter written by Neal Cassady to Jack Kerouac in 1951. And the writing style of the letter was what ultimately inspired the writing style of On the Road. And for many, many decades, the first half of this letter was missing. Only the second half was available to read. The second half was published in the first third. It was published in a series of collected letters by Neal Cassady. But it wasn't until 2014 when they finally found the missing half of this letter. And then in 2020 it was published here as the Joan Anderson Letter by Neal Cassady. So I had already read the second half of the letter and been looking forward to reading the first half for quite a while. So I finally bought this book to read it. And I have some mixed feelings about it. Definitely I would say this book, they try to milk it as much as they can. It has a very, very long introduction. It going into the history of the letter, talking about Neal Cassady, Jack Kerouac, the Beat Generation, how the Beat Generation, ultimately this letter, influenced the counterculture of the 1960s. So there wasn't a ton of new information that I learned reading that. I definitely got a little more of the history of the letter itself was interesting to read, but as far as new information, it wasn't that much stuff that I learned reading it. But when it gets to the letter itself, I will say that the first half of the letter is definitely better than the second half. I think the first half represents a little more the writing style that influence On the Road. You definitely see a lot more of that influence in the first half of the letter. And not to spoil the letter for anyone who hasn't read it in entirety, but the first half of the letter goes into detail about the suicide attempt of Joan Anderson, which is where the second half of the letter picks up right after that happened, where Neal Cassady is visiting Joan Anderson in the hospital. So it was cool to see the first half of where the story actually started. So it was nice in that sense to see the entire letter. But I mean, obviously the first half was a little more well written. You definitely see a lot more of the On the Road influence, or how it influenced On the Road in the writing style. But I wouldn't say it's necessary. You definitely get a sense of that in the second half. It just the first half captures it a little better. But it doesn't add that much to understanding the impact of this letter on Jack Kerouac. So it has the whole letter in entirety. It's very large font. They were trying to make this as long as they can, because there's only, I think, a 16,000 or 18,000 word letter. So it was long, but it wasn't, very, very long. And then it has a whole biography, a timeline of Neal Cassady's life, a timeline of Jack Kerouac's life. It has a bibliography of different writings published by Jack Kerouac, Neal Cassady, other people in the Beat Generation. I mean, it's kind of cool to have a little timeline here, a little bibliography of different books that were written, but they kind of just try to make this as long as they possibly could. It does have, in the end, actual photographs of the actual letter, so it's kind of cool to see what the letter looked like. But ultimately, would I call this a must-read? No. If you're really interested in Neal Cassady, really interested in the Beat Generation, it's definitely probably necessary to read just to understand the letter in entirety. But I don't feel like I took a ton away from this. I'm glad I read it. Definitely not a must-read. But yeah, it's cool they finally found the letter in entirety that was finally able to be published. A little expensive buying this. It was almost $30 on the buy. I believe it's out of print now. Definitely wasn't worth the price tag, but at the end of the day, I'm glad I read it. It's definitely, I call it a historical document, this letter. It definitely influenced On the Road. And On the Road definitely influenced counterculture in American history. So it's kind of cool to see. But yeah, not much to it. You can read the whole letter if you want. If not, you're not missing too much. Anyway, be sure to subscribe and we'll see you in the next video.